I would say my usual little opening of good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is for all of you, but I'm about to make it much, much worse. I'm not actually. Okay, maybe I am. Depends on the person. I know there's one person out there who's gonna be like, I told you not to do this, you little. And to him I say, I'm sorry, except I'm not. I have my tea, I have my notes. I'm hoping this will be short, but it probably won't. And how did I spill tea all already? I've had this tea for 5 seconds. I literally made this like 5 seconds ago. How did I already do that? Anyways, let's talk Destiel. Now, disclosure. I was part of the SBN fandom in the 2010s when I was a young teenager. I definitely wasn't supposed to be watching it by my family standards. I haven't watched anything past probably season 6 or 7. 7 tops. Like, I've seen a little bit of season 7, but only a couple episodes here and there. I stopped kind of watching it season 6. Didn't enjoy the plot much anymore. So take that as you will. For those of you who are diehard fans, know that I'm not ragging on it. I just fell out of love with it. You know, that happens sometimes. You're totally allowed to do that. You're allowed to love TV shows for a while and not enjoy them after a while. I have fond memories of my time in the fandom. For the most part. I stayed to my own little fandom corner. I didn't get involved in the big stuff. But how did I get my glasses so off kilter? Probably because I keep tilting my head. But what we're here to talk about today was Destiel becoming canon, except it didn't. So, like I said, I haven't kept up with it, and then all of this happened, and so I did a little bit of research, but mostly what I'm going to talk about is the canonization of Castiel as homosexual, how that works with the fandom, how that works with the fandom I used to know, how that works with the way the fandom is now, how that's working with intertextuality, in general, queering of the narrative, which is what this series is. So, I'm going to make a minor note here, which is to say, if you don't know some of the influences behind Supernatural, there are plenty of rumors out there and some things that have been more formally admitted, or whatever you want to call it, as far as influences from Hellblazer, which is a DC Comics title. And if you've read it or seen anything with John Constantine in it, then you know what I'm talking about. Castiel's look is very close to the look of John Constantine. A lot of the things that are played off in Supernatural come very heavily from Hellblazer. There's a lot of influence there. There were rumors about Constantine being in it. And they're both, like, Constantine's now in CW shows, which are also in Supernatural. There's a lot of stuff there. You can go look it up if you want to. I'm making this note about influences and inspiration simply because it's important to know that John Constantine is a canon bisexual, and has been for a very long time. One of the, if not, somebody correct me on this, but one of the first superheroes. I say this because he's not really a superhero, but one of the first, like, characters in superhero comic books to come out as queer. And he's been a queer icon for a very long time, despite his problems. But he's a good character, he's a fun character, and he's a very important character to queer literature and the history of queer literature, simply because of the time when he came into precedence as a character and the time at which he came out. I say that because he's a character. He can't actually come out. That's the writer's choice, but you know what I mean. So just keep that in mind, that there are influences and inspiration already taken from things like Hellblazer, which have canonly queer characters and canonly queer themes that went into Supernatural, which were kind of completely abandoned. There's not a lot of the political side of Hellblazer that comes into Supernatural. There's not a lot of the queering side that comes into Supernatural. There's not a lot of the stuff that makes John Constantine is not in Supernatural, despite the influences you can see from Hellblazer, if that makes sense. So Castiel and John Constantine are nowhere near the same, despite the fact that they share the same look, for anybody who hasn't read Hellblazer. But that's just something interesting to note. So, does it have anything to do with Destiel? Not really. Maybe a little bit, but not really. So, let's talk about why first. Why Destiel became such a kind of phenomenon. And part of it has to do with when Supernatural came out, the influences it had, the amount of just fan base it had. It blew up. In the last couple of years, it's become kind of a cultural phenomenon. Despite the fact that it didn't have a super big following to start with, it was kind of off to the side. It just had more of a cult following that erupted quite quickly in certain seasons. And especially in the first 5 seasons, and the whole show really, there aren't a lot of women in it. And this happens a lot with shows that are given a queer subtext or are given are queered by the fans later on. A lot of them don't. It's because there either aren't a lot of women or there aren't a lot of men. And so when that happens, there's a desire for relationships that people generally have, because you see these relationships grow more serious and we become more invested in them over time. And when they're only between men or only between women, we have a tendency to then start to ship them, as it were. And this happens a lot, and it's very common in fandoms. Supernatural is not the start of that. It's not the end of that. Actually, if you start looking back at Star Trek, that's where it really kind of started with big fandom stuff. And you can see a lot of that history there, and it's continued on in many, many, many circles. The thing with Supernatural is it got really, really big, and it continued on for a very, very long time. And throughout most of that run, there's been very few female characters who have lasted more than a season. And if they have been large parts of a season, by which I mean like showing up in more than like a half to 3/4 of the episodes, and have survived. Many of them have died. And interestingly, in Supernatural's case, many of the male characters have died and come back more than once as far as the main ones go. I'm talking Castiel, Dean, Sam, and the like. They've died and come back for various reasons. Gabriel as well. Lucifer, kind of. I guess, does being cast into hell count? That's the wrong side. I guess if being cast into hell counts, then like he died and came back. I cannot remember which side I'm doing stuff on. You know, a lot of male characters have died or been removed from the show and then come back later on. Very few of the female characters have gotten that chance. And if they have, I can't actually think of any off the top of my head. Maybe some have, but it's very rare. And they certainly don't get the amount of character development that these male characters get. So this is quite common. You see this in like Star Trek, where it's a majority male cast, very few female characters, and the ones that, other than Uhura, I can think of very few female characters across like TOS that show up for more than one episode and have a significant amount of screen time. So you end up with people looking at these deep male relationships and thinking, wouldn't it be good if they got together? Because they clearly care about each other. And you just don't, you can't get that sort of thing between a male and a female when you don't have females who seem like people. Because this lack of screen time equals a lack of characterization. You have less time to make that female character a character we care about, a character who is going to improve or change over time, and a character with meaningful motivations and meaningful history and a place to go. They just kind of get stuck. They might have a history that's interesting, a motivation that's interesting, or they might end up in an interesting place. But they generally, you can't put all three because you don't have the screen time, or if you do, it feels very forced. It happens too quickly. So we don't get invested in relationships. You see this a lot with Dean. And I'm not saying you can't have womanizer characters that are interesting and don't do something interesting or have interesting relationships with women. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. I don't watch a lot of shows with womanizer types. I'm not my favorite type of main character. But Dean is interesting because you see him with women. We know he canonically has relationships with women. The problem is we don't see these women enough to care about them. So we would rather Dean go back off with Sam or go back off with Castiel and at least go back to being like have more meaningful friendships with them than having those relationships with women because we just don't care about them as much. It's just harder for us to care about them, if that makes sense. So the largely male cast is given the opposite of what the female characters are getting. The thing with it is that this largely male cast, this cast of male characters is getting the things that the females are not, that the female characters are not. They're getting screen time, they're getting characterization, they're getting investment into their relationships, the ones that already exist and the ones that are being created. We're getting the time to make those feel natural. The difference with that, with especially relationships, is we're not getting the time for them to feel natural. I'm thinking about, I think Sam comes back from hell or something like that. I don't even remember. Sam's gone for a while. He comes back. Dean's like living the white picket fence life with a woman. And when I watched it, I couldn't really care. I think it was Lisa was her name. I couldn't really care for her because I didn't get the time to be invested in their relationship. It didn't feel natural. It was like it wasn't there at the end of the season, and the next season it was there, and it was quick, and then it was like over basically. And so we don't get the time to feel like things progress naturally, and this happens a lot in this kind of situation. Whereas the male cast is given these things, the relationship between Dean and Castiel is given so much time to feel natural, to feel like it's progressing somewhere, like they're getting closer and closer. So even if it doesn't end in a romantic relationship, we know they were extremely close. We know that they care about each other, and the same goes for other male characters in that situation. Male characters in that situation, you know? This is like, think Sherlock and Watson. This happens with them as well. They're given so much time together that their relationship and the progression of their relationship feels very natural. It feels very smooth. It feels like something that we would see in real life set into this fantastical setting that we could never live in. So it makes sense for people to then see more into their relationship and to at least see them as extremely close, if not start to then wish they were in a deeper relationship, if that makes sense. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the fandom, because I think most people understand the why with that. I think there's been a lot of talk about female characters in media and male-dominated media and stuff like that. I think people understand that, and I think then the trick there, excuse me, I think the trick there then is understanding how underrepresentation of women leads to the queering of media, if that makes sense. So let's talk about the fandom a bit. So the first thing I want to talk about, actually this isn't really fandom, this is kind of an interlude point which has more to do with the show writers, with the writers and with the themes of the show. And I just want to talk about, and especially with the first 5 seasons, because of course the first 5 seasons are where we get most of those like Monster of the Week style ones. I just want to talk quickly about monsters as othering. Traditionally, we this is going to sound really bad, but follow me for a second. We equate monsters with the weird, the strange, the unknowable, the queer, essentially. And part of that was done as when some monster fiction was written, people were afraid of what they didn't know, and part of that was homosexuality or being transgender and stuff like that. People were afraid of different sexualities and different gender presentations, and so it's seen as monstrous and strange. And then, having been othered that way for so long, the queer community started to take that on as almost an identity. It was something to be proud of, almost, was your otherness. And because monsters, especially in like horror media, in horror films and the like, are so othered, we feel a kinship with that otherness, with that strangeness, with that ability to horrify. And so then you become proud of that aspect rather than disgusted by it, or rather than feeling ashamed of it. And it's just a natural progression of how we take in the things that we are given, we make the identity our own, and then we push it back out as a positive thing. What's a good example of this? I'm thinking an example of that would be Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, Medusa, think Shape of Water and stuff like that. That's specifically, that has its own tones and stuff like that. But think about monsters like that. We feel queer people tend to feel a kinship with those kind of monsters simply because they're othered, they're feared by society. We can see ourselves in them, we see our experiences in them. But a lot of times these monsters are given a power over people. Think Hyde, think Frankenstein's monster, Frankenstein's creature, stuff like that, where not only are they othered, not only do they have that terrifying aspect to them, they also have the ability to hold something over other people. They have a power over the populace. They're like in the case of Hyde, he's short and tiny and terrifying, but also extremely strong, apparently quite smart, considering everything he gets away with. And Frankenstein's creature, who is powerful and inhumanly strong and tall and just able to tear human limb from limb. They're given an ability to enact against their oppressors in a way that we generally are not, which allows us to identify with them further, if this makes sense. So when you get into that Monster of the Week sort of format, you get a position where the beings that are seen as othered are vilified. And in Supernatural specifically, it's very rare that these creatures are not vilified. There's a couple episodes I can think of in the first couple seasons, but even so, in witchcraft and magic and that sort of thing is fairly frequently that's off the shelf, no go. But so is religion to some degree. It's kind of interesting. But those othered monsters are generally what queer people would identify, but because we don't get a long-running history with those creatures, we don't get to see them in more than one episode, it's hard to identify with them in that sense. The examples I can think of then come down to the beings that are othered, but are we see more throughout the show, so we're able to identify with them better, which comes down to Castiel, Gabriel, Benny the vampire from the one season. The only part I liked about that season. Crowley, people like that, who are othered from Sam and Dean because they're not human, but are also given human characteristics and human qualities. They're given development, so we can identify with them better, if that makes sense. And that pushing of that othering onto characters like that also allows us to see the positives in them. It allows us to see the humanity in them as well, which is what we all want to, of course, see in ourselves to some degree. And what we want to see people see us as. We want people to see us as human. And so the development of those characters being seen first as extremely, like just, not extremely, where it's black and white. They're human or they're not. They're good or they're not. They're good or they're bad. And then the development into them being more human, the development into them being seen as characters, to being seen as people, is a development we want to see in ourselves. Think back again to Frankenstein's creature. While we see sympathy for the creature right off the bat because we know that he's been abandoned by Victor and the like, the more we read, the further we see that he just wants love and he just wants to be accepted and stuff like that, the more we see the development of him as a person. And so it becomes easier and easier to identify with the creature. Does that make sense? So, with that being said, there's also canon versus fanon, which is very interesting. And like I said, I haven't kept up with the fandom much since probably the 2010s. I say that saying it's 2020. I mean like 2010 to 2015 kind of thing. I haven't kept up with it in quite a while. But the fandom kind of ran with it, whereas canon moved slower. Canon moved in a more, I would say, natural progression of their relationships, but there were definitely times where like I was like, that's okay, sure, that was a choice. But canon moved in a different sort of aspect than to what I suppose most fans were hoping for. But because it continued that slow, constantly progressive, there was no stop to the progression of their relationship. Their relationship was constantly getting closer. The stakes were constantly getting higher. They were constantly doing things for each other that made the stakes higher, that made the relationship more serious and more attached. Whereas we see that with Sam and Dean almost right off the bat. We see them willing to do things for each other that we can hardly think of doing for people. And we see that progression slowly with Dean and Castiel, where they're willing to do things for each other that are just absolutely bonkers, if that makes sense. And so the progression gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and with that, the fandom gets more and more involved in their relationship. So with that comes the separation of canon and fanon, and what canon did versus what fandom did. Fandom made it basically like, this exists, and the problem with that then came with harassment, which I'm not going to talk too much about. I don't really want to talk about the actors with this. I'm talking about the writers a little bit. Actors have to do things they don't like all the time. Sometimes they can say yes, sometimes they can say no. It is what it is, you know? Sometimes they don't agree with the direction that a show or a movie or anything went in. Sometimes they do. It doesn't really matter. I know, like, right now there's a lot of, like, backlash about whether, like, Jensen Ackles, like, wanted this, whether he was against it, whether he did things to make it, like, less canon or whatever. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. We have a saying in literature, which is death of the author, which is separating the text from the author, saying that this was the author's intentions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what, like, came out of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the most, like, important part of it, if that makes sense. And to some degree that's true. And while actors can definitely have some say in things, and that they can make certain choices that make a show go one way or another, they can choose to, like, really overact in one part, underact in another, you know, or they can choose to take the directions they've been given and take it in one direction or take it in another direction if they're given that amount of freedom. They have even less say on it than the author does. So it's kind of a death of the actor thing, which comes honestly far before death of the author, you know. It is what it is. I wouldn't necessarily say that he did anything one way or another. He was probably directed to act a certain way, and if you act too much, if he had shown real disdain for what they were doing, he probably would have gotten in trouble for it unless they told him to. So, like, you know, if it wasn't something that the writers and the directors and stuff were okay with the way he did it, then it wouldn't have hit the screen. So take that as you will. I don't agree with some of the harassment that's happened over the years, but again, I haven't really kept up with it, so I'm not gonna, like, go off on that too much on a tangent. Also, because I think it takes away the stuff that's gone on outside takes away from the conversation of the show itself. Let's talk about queerbaiting, because that is a real true phenomenon. And back in the early 2010s, I would say it was very, very common, and a lot of shows have gotten away with it, have gone away from it, sorry, because there's been a lot of backlash to shows that do this. Sometimes people call things queerbaiting that is not actually queerbaiting. People will say it's queerbaiting because they didn't end up in a relationship together, and sometimes that's true, but in other cases, there's just as much as you might like two characters together, that doesn't mean there's enough basis for a relationship there, or that they'd be good together, or that the writers don't have intentions for them beyond that to some degree, that they don't have intentions for one character to end up with somebody else or something like that. And you, like, Destiel's one thing because it went on for so long, and the writers were absolutely aware of what the fandom was asking for and what the fandom was saying, so it was considerably more like queerbaiting. And this is where I draw it back to the history a little bit, simply because Castiel is dressed so much like John Constantine, and it's just like, you got, like, maybe some people in the later seasons didn't really know that reference, but I can guarantee when he was first written into the show, people like the writers and directors and stuff may have been told of that reference when he was done in that wardrobe. So it becomes a little bit then iffy simply because of the history of John Constantine as a character, and then using that callback in a character and holding out on us for so many seasons, if that makes sense. So that is why I brought in that history earlier on, just because I think it is important to note that there's definitely more of a case for queerbaiting because of that than there is in some other media. I'm not arguing this isn't queerbaiting. I think this was absolutely a case of queerbaiting for a very long time, especially because into the later seasons, the writers and directors knew what the fandom was saying and what they wanted and would tease at it and then pull it away. It would be one thing if they hadn't teased at it, if they had just kept things simple and linear and without that sort of implication and just kept things going along in that direction, then that would have been fine. But they have teased at it over the seasons, which does make it queerbaiting. And I think a lot of the reason that it took off so prevalently is because with that history for some people, and with the way that it was played, and with how genuine and how well written the relationship was, especially in the earlier seasons, early 2010s, like, I think Tumblr and stuff like that really, like, shot off with Destiel, and I think it has to do with the fact that we could genuinely see a case for that to become canon, and we thought it might happen a lot sooner, whereas a lot of media, you just don't see that big of a response simply because it just seems so far-fetched for the writers to do that. And I guess that's just kind of what people were hoping for, so there's that. Jesus Christ, this has ended up being a lot longer than I wanted to be. I was like, this will be a 15-minute, like, I'm just gonna chat this out. I failed. This is, however, going to be my last little bit. And this has to do with that episode and what happened. Start with, is it worse than queerbaiting? That's, I think, up to the individual. For me, yes, I think it is. I think the stereotypes, the underlying implications of it are absolutely worse than queerbaiting. I think so 100%. I think it was insulting to some degree. I think it was playing on stereotypes and playing on religious lies that have been coming down for years and years and years and are just outdated and rude and shouldn't be on TV anymore at all. And the reason I specifically think that sort of thing is worse than queerbaiting is because I think queerbaiting, while outdated and annoying in some respects, I think allows for a little bit of hope and allows for an evolution. And I think in some shows it allows another writer to come along later and to make it from queerbaiting to make things canon. Because obviously Destiel is not really actually canon, it's just canon that Cass is queer to some degree. I think it's just I just think queerbaiting can give a little bit more hope, and while it's outdated, it's not as outdated as the stereotypes and the literary connections that were made in this confession. I really don't. Like, I really don't think queerbaiting is as bad as that. I don't think it's great, but I don't think it's as bad as what happened. And part of that is just because how overly religious it comes off. The idea that a queer character, the only real queer character we've had that has gotten this much development. I know there was a lesbian in earlier seasons, Charlie, I think it was, but I mean, she got buried as well. It's a buried your gays trope, which has been happening forever, and which is, I think, much worse than queer baiting, because it implies that the only way for there to be a happy ending is for queer people to die, which is disgusting and so outdated and so horrible. And this one's even worse than that, because not only did he die, he went to Superhell, which is just go to hell, which is overly religious, disgusting. It implies, again, that being queer is a sin, that being queer is immoral, that being queer is unnatural. And I understand that the show writers maybe thought that they could get away with this simply because it wasn't about him being queer, it was about him being happy. But the connection is still there. If they had made it about anything else, I could understand their logic. But it is not fair to separate the long-held stereotype and the long-held insults and religious hypocrisy. It is not fair to ask the audience to separate that from what they're showing, which has implications of it. To say, well, you know what, that was a while ago, so you guys can separate these two things. I know they're happening at the same time, but they're not really connected, so just ignore it. Like, just separate those things in your brain. That's not fair. That's not fair to ask the queer community to do. It's absolutely not. There's too much history there, and the writers and directors and actors, and like, nobody should have let that pass. People know that. You wouldn't ask. I don't even know. It makes me angry. It just makes me angry. There's so much history there, and there's so much just pain and suffering when it comes to the topic of queerness and the idea of a religious hell, and of being damned upon your death and being killed for being queer, because he's essentially dying because he decided to say that he was queer and in love with Dean. There's so much pain and history there that it is absolutely not fair for anybody to ask that a queer audience separate those two things. To separate the idea of, oh, it was because of the happiness in the deal that he made and the fact that he's queer. To separate those two things because they're happening at the same time. It's not fair. It really isn't. And my another issue with that, my slightly smaller issue with that, is religion had been a villain for so kind of long. I mean, God was a villain at one point in Supernatural, if I remember correctly, because like I said, I didn't watch it, but watched those episodes, but I heard plenty about it. So then to use such religious symbolism when religion and God and the idea of that sort of thing has been a villain for so long in the series makes no sense to me whatsoever. It really doesn't. Maybe in 2010 you could have gotten away with this and it would have been, well, at least we got a gay character, you know, bury your gays, but like at least they went from queer baiting to like having having him come out as like a canon queer character, but like, no, I'm sorry, it's 2020, you know better. They should have avoided it altogether. It feels like fan service in the worst way. Because they were like, well, you know, we're ending, so let's give the fans what they want. Except they absolutely didn't give us what they wanted. If you look at fandom in any type, most of it's happy endings. It's the tone of the show is so dark and so depressive and so dismal that fans wanted a happy ending. So you can't say it's fan service in that sense because it wasn't a happy ending in the slightest. And to say that this is acceptable fan service just because we made a character clear that you had long wanted to be queer it's ridiculous. It doesn't work. It should have been avoided. I don't think it was the right way to do it. I think if they really wanted to give the fans what the fans have been wanting for so many years, those two it should have been a separate coming out and then a separate like, I don't know, the deal or whatever happened, because there's too much history, there's too much connotation there. That sort of religious not intention, that sort of religious and queer history combining, and the way that it was done is just, I'm mad actually now. I wasn't mad when this first happened. I thought like the memes were really funny and stuff like that, but like I'm mad thinking about the concept of it, because I think people know better, and I think we can do better, and I just think it was kind of a slap in the face. I know there are plenty of fans who might not have seen that connotation, might not have cared about that connotation, but I think to a lot of queer people who have come from religious families who have been told over and over again that they're going to hell for who they love, I think that that's just a slap in the face. I really do. Nobody should ever be told that they are going to hell because of who they love. And I think in this case, that message was said word for word by that scene. Because Cass is literally going to hell for who he loves. And that's all I have to say about it. So I'm sorry this got really kind of dark towards the end and dismal. For anybody watching this, I mean, just go read Hellblazer or something. It's got the same tone and stuff as, not same tone, but it's got the same, you know, depressive atmosphere and stuff that like Supernatural tried to pull on. Got some of the same elements. Like, it's better, at least as far as representation goes. There's a lot of things with better representation, I think, that we could be supporting and watching and pulling for now in the modern age in 2020. I don't think we need to be stuck in this this cycle of subtext and disappointing endings. It's the idea that we need to be just happy with subtext and then ecstatic if we get a canonization but an unhappy ending is ridiculous. And I understand to some degree that people are going to say, well, but it's in the tone of the show. It's your finale. It doesn't have to be. We don't have to make everything sad and depressive right at the end. You know, we can have hope for a happy ending. And I know people will say, well, you know, Hellblazer's depressing and dark, and, you know, it's not a happy ending. And while I would agree, we at least have moments and glimmers where it's a little bit, that there's some sort of hope there, and it comes with the politicization of it too. There's well, at least very little politicization in Supernatural that I think calls for that sort of thing, whereas I think Hellblazer does a good job on delivering on other aspects that give it a reason to be so kind of dark and depressive at times. Whereas Supernatural just uses that as a general atmosphere, and when it's just an atmosphere, it doesn't need to be carried through with so much conviction and with so much consistency. It really doesn't. So yeah, I guess that's my thoughts on that. I understand there'd be people who won't agree with me. I really do. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with me in the slightest. You can be ecstatic for this ending if that's the way you feel about it. You can be supportive of this ending. That's totally your call. I would just ask that people understand that there are reasons for people to be upset with it, and that I think we can all agree that we can do better. That even if you thought that this was a good end, if you thought that this was the best thing that could have happened, we can do better. We can have better. As a queer audience, we can have better than that. So again, I don't really know whether signing off in my usual manner is appropriate at this time, but I hope this found everyone well. I hope it was somewhat interesting. If you have other media you wanted me to talk about in Queering the Narrative series, leave a suggestion down in the comments. I'd love to do some stuff. I have a Demon Knights one planned, which nobody's heard of, and I'm just going to do it for myself, but I don't care. But yeah, I'd love to do more of these. I think they're really interesting. If you have any questions for me, if you want clarification on something, like, feel free to ask. I obviously won't tolerate, like, people arguing or being rude, but in the comments, but, you know, everybody's entitled to their opinion, and I think you should be allowed to express it, and if this is videos like this are how you choose to express your opinion, go for it. Because I clearly think it's a fun way to do it. If mildly infuriating as you get going, but yeah. So, have a good day, everyone. Thanks for listening. Bye.